violently behind her and put his hand over her mouth. She couldn't scream or talk or move, and was held there watching the two men beat her husband. On the sidewalk, 10 feet behind the violence, stood 3 figures, each wearing the white Klan robes. They came out of the darkness and watched the beating. After an impossibly long, horrible minute, the beating slowed down. "Enough," said the white figure in the middle. The men left, and Ethel ran down the steps and held her unconscious husband in her arms. Jake left the hospital after midnight. Bud was still alive, but he had suffered another serious heart attack, as well as the broken bones. Ethel had shouted and screamed at Jake, blaming him for everything.
"You said there was no danger," she screamed. "It's all your fault."
Jake had looked around the small waiting room at the friends and relatives. All eyes were on him. Yes, they seemed to say. It was all his fault. Carl Lee Haley and his wife were angry too. Gwen had no money to pay her bills, and Carl Lee had no money to pay for his defense. But they had heard that Reverend Agee had collected over $6,000 from black churchgoers to help Carl Lee. Why had they not received any of the money yet, they demanded. Jake had arranged a meeting with Reverend Agee after Gwen visited his office to ask for help with the bills she could no longer pay. He had telephoned the Reverend and asked him to come to his office to talk about the defense. Ozzie Walls had brought Carl Lee across the square, too. Reverend Agee had tried to frighten Carl Lee, to tell him he was ungrateful. The church was keeping the money for any future defense. Ozzie helped the Reverend to see that he was making a mistake. "I agree with Carl Lee and Gwen. Reverend Agee, you ain't done right, and you know it." "That hurts, Ozzie, coming from you. It really hurts." "Let me tell you what's gonna hurt a lot more than that. Next Sunday, Carl Lee and I will be in your church. Carl Lee will do the talking. He'll tell all your people that the money they've given so generously has not left your pocket, that Gwen and the children are gonna lose their house because you're keeping the money people gave. He'll tell them that you lied to them. He may talk for an hour or so. When he's finished, I'll say a few words. I'll tell them what a lying, dishonest nigger you are. I'll tell them about the time you bought that stolen car in Memphis for $100 and almost got sent to jail. I'll tell them about the money you get from the funeral business. And, Reverend, I'll tell—" "Don't say it, Ozzie," Agee begged. "I'll tell them a dirty little secret that only you and me and a certain woman of bad character know about." "When do you want the money?" "As soon as you can get it," Carl Lee demanded. Ozzie could be very persuasive sometimes. The Klan were also making preparations. At around 9 o'clock that evening, they met to discuss their next steps. They would have a big march at the beginning of the trial, and, like Jake, had been able to get a copy of the list of possible jurors. They planned to visit a few and make sure that they remembered their duty to protect the interests of the white race. Later that same evening, at Lucien's house, Jake, Ellen, Harry Rex, and Lucien sat round the table on the porch. Lucien, at the head of the table, went through the jury list, commenting on every name he recognized. He was drunker than normal. Chapter 10. The Jury. During the 7 days before the trial, the people of Clanton began to feel they were living in a foreign country. First, there were the busloads of black people who arrived and set up a camp outside the courthouse. Their leader, the Reverend Agee, told the reporters that they would stay until justice was done and Carl Lee was freed. The crowd began to shout, "Free Carl Lee! Free Carl Lee!" After the blacks came the Klan. They arrived in groups of 2 and 3 and came from all over the state. Their leader, Stump Sisson, was pleased. He drank some whiskey as he checked their dress. He was proud of his men and told them so. This was the biggest meeting of its kind in years, he said. The march could be dangerous, he explained. Niggers could march and scream all day long, and no one cared. But if whites tried to march, it was dangerous. The niggers could do what they liked, but not white people. Few people in Clanton had ever seen the Klan march, and as 2 p.m. approached, a great wave of excitement went around the square. The shopkeepers and their customers came out to watch, and a group of young blacks gathered under a large tree. Ozzie smelled trouble, but they told him they had only come to watch and listen. The Klan moved slowly in their white robes and tall pointed masks. Stump walked proudly in front of his men, leading them down the long sidewalk to the center of the square by the courthouse steps.
"You niggers were not invited to this meeting,"
Stump screamed into the microphone, pointing at the blacks on the grass.
"This is a Klan meeting, not a meeting for niggers."
As he started to speak, the black people who had gathered around the square started to shout, "Free Carl Lee! Free Carl Lee!"
"Shut up, you wild niggers!"
Stump screamed back.
"Shut up, you animals!"
His men stood facing him, with their backs to the screaming crowd. Ozzie and 6 deputies moved between the groups. As the photographers and TV reporters moved in circles, trying to record everything that was happening, no one noticed a small window on the 3rd floor of the courthouse. It opened slowly, and from the darkness, a firebomb was thrown. It landed perfectly at Stump's feet and exploded. Immediately, the Klan leader's long white robe went up in flames. Stump Sisson was having his 5 minutes of fame. The violence which followed the firebomb was the worst there had ever been in the small town. Blacks and whites fought with their hands, sticks, and knives, not stopping until Ozzie Walls and his deputies fired their guns in the air. When things became quieter, Ozzie went to the town hall. He asked the leader of the town council to contact the governor. He wanted the National Guard to be called in. As sheriff, he felt the situation was out of control, and he needed the army to help keep order. Clanton had seen nothing like it before. Jake, Ellen Rourke, Harry Rex, and Lucien spent the rest of the week preparing for the trial. They had 2 main jobs. The first was to find the people who would make the best jury for Carl Lee. They studied the list of names again and again, trying to decide which ones to choose. They knew that Buckley would look for an all-white jury that would find Carl Lee guilty. They needed to get some black people on the jury, but they also knew it would be difficult because there were so few blacks in Clanton. The second job was to prepare Carl Lee's insanity defense. This was Ellen's responsibility. By the end of the week, Jake knew the names and life histories of every person on the jury list, and Ellen had given him a thick file which contained everything he needed to present a strong insanity defense. He knew that he should feel confident, but he became more and more nervous as the first day of the trial came nearer. Maybe it was the burning crosses that the Klan had put outside the houses of 20 of the people whose names were on the jury list. Maybe it was the late nights he was spending with Lucien, Harry Rex, and Ellen, and the large amounts of alcohol they all seemed to be drinking. Maybe it was just the fact that this was the biggest, most important trial he had ever worked on, that he had very little money, that his wife and daughter had had to leave town, and that his wife was still not speaking to him. On the morning of Monday, July 22nd, the day they were going to choose the jury, Jake woke up in his office before the sun, feeling terrible after another late night and too much whiskey. Harry Rex came early with breakfast. Jake could not eat his, so Harry Rex ate for the two of them. Ellen arrived a little later, dressed in a dark gray suit. Harry Rex told her that it was the first time she looked like a lawyer. As the sun rose, the National Guard started to move around the court building. Soldiers stood at each corner of the courthouse square, watching the groups of reporters, black people, and Klan members who had started to arrive. As soon as they saw the white masks, the black people started to shout, "Free Carl Lee! Free Carl Lee!" The Klan replied by screaming back, "Fry Carl Lee! Fry Carl Lee!" Soldiers carrying guns ran across the square and stood between the two groups. By the time the buses carrying the possible jury members arrived, Jake felt terrible. When he was still a young lawyer, Lucien had told him to make friends with fear, because it would never go away. Lucien had also said that the jury always listened to a lawyer who was brave enough to be himself. Jake knew about the fear, but was not sure if he wanted to be himself. His head ached too much.
"How are you, boss?"
Ellen asked. "Ready, I guess. We'll leave in a minute."
"There were some reporters waiting outside. I told them you had dropped the case and left town."
"Wouldn't that be nice?" Jury selection was a long and complicated process. 114 people had been asked to do their duty as citizens. The 20 who had had a burning cross in their yards were told that they need not stay. That left 94 names. Each lawyer then had the right to interview each juror. Buckley began with a list of 1,000 questions. When Noose stopped him at 5 o'clock, he had still not finished. He said he would finish in the morning. The next day, the sun rose quickly. A morning mist hung over the ground, wetting the boots of the soldiers outside the courthouse. By the time breakfast was served, the day was already hot, and the soldiers had taken off their jackets and stood around in their pale green undershirts. The black church leaders and their followers returned to their part of the square, and the Klansmen kept together on their side. It was 9 a.m. of day 2. Jake had a difficult job to do after Buckley's 3-hour questioning the day before. His first question showed that he wanted to simplify things. "Ladies and gentlemen, do any of you believe that the insanity defense should not be used in a murder trial?" The possible jurors looked at each other, but no hands went up. Insanity. Insanity. The seed had been planted.
If we prove that Carl Lee Haley was legally insane when he shot Billy Ray Cobb and Pete Willard, is there a person here who cannot find him not guilty?
The question was hard to follow. That was the way Jake wanted it. Again, there were no hands. A few wanted to answer, but they were not sure how to. Jake looked at them carefully. He knew that most of them were confused, but he also knew that for this moment, every possible juror was thinking about his client being insane. He would leave them there.
"Thank you,"
he said, with all the charm he could manage.
"I have no more questions."
Buckley looked confused. He stared at the judge.
"Is that all?" Noose asked. "Is that all, Mr. Briggins?" "Yes, sir. These citizens look fine to me,"
Jake said. The group was not at all acceptable to Jake. Too white, too many women. But there was no sense repeating the same questions Buckley had asked. Now that the list of possible jurors had been agreed, the next stage of jury selection could begin. Judge Noose and the lawyers left the courtroom and sat at the table in the judge's office. Noose looked at his numbered list and then looked at his lawyers.
"Gentlemen, are you ready? Good. Since this is a murder case, each of you has the right to refuse to accept 12 of the jurors. Mr. Buckley, you must now give a list of 12 jurors to the defense. Please start with juror number 1 and refer to each juror only by number."
As they worked through the selection process, it became clear that Jake's worst fears were coming true. Buckley repeatedly suggested white jurors who were clearly against Carl Lee. Jake could not say no to them all. 12 was the limit. So he found himself accepting people he knew would be against his client. And each time Jake offered one of the few jurors he really wanted, Buckley refused him or her. The numbers were on Buckley's side. For every juror that Jake thought might be good for Carl Lee, Buckley had 10 who would be against him. When the last juror had been chosen, Judge Noose and the lawyers returned to their places. His Honor called the names of the 12, and they slowly, nervously made their way to the jury box. 10 women, 2 men, all white. The blacks in the courtroom looked at each other in disbelief.
"Did you pick that jury?"
Carl Lee asked Jake. Stump Sisson died on Tuesday night at the Burns Hospital in Memphis. 4 people had now died as a result of the rape of Tanya Haley. Cobb, Willard, Bud Twitty, and now Sisson. When the Klan members met in the woods that evening, they wanted revenge. Stump Sisson would be remembered. Around midnight, Jake walked up and down his office and gave his opening speech for the 100th time. Ellen listened. She had listened, objected, criticized, and argued for 2 hours. She was tired now. He did it perfectly. When he finished, they went to the window and watched the lights being held by the blacks sitting in the darkness of the square. They could hear laughter from the card games in the soldiers' tents. There was no moon. Chapter 11. The Trial Begins. The bus arrived at the courthouse 5 minutes before 9. The jurors looked out through darkened windows to see how many blacks and how many Klansmen were waiting,
and how many National Guard soldiers. When Judge Noose was ready to start, they were led into the courtroom and then into the jury box. Rufus Buckley, as prosecutor, had the right to speak first, and he clearly intended to enjoy every minute. He started by thanking the jurors for being there, as if they had a choice, thought Jake. He said he was proud to be working with them in this most important case. Jake sat and listened. It was all garbage, and he had heard it before, but it still annoyed him, because the jury sometimes believed it. Then Buckley started to talk about the rape and how terrible it was. He said that he was a father, too. In fact, he had a daughter the same age as Tanya Haley, but that no one could take the law into their own hands. Jake smiled quickly at Ellen. This was interesting. Buckley had chosen to talk about the rape instead of keeping it from the jury. Jake had been expecting a problem with Buckley when it came to this topic. Normally, it would not be accepted as evidence during a murder trial, especially the more unpleasant details. But now Buckley had introduced the subject, so he was not going to be able to object when Jake told the jury about what the murdered men had done and how the rape had destroyed Tanya's life and the life of Carl Lee Haley. The next mistake that Buckley made was to speak for too long. Although he had started with the jury on his side, by the end they were bored and finding it difficult to stay awake. Jake was winning the first argument without saying a word. Jake had already planned a short opening speech, and after Buckley's effort, he decided to make it even shorter. He only spoke for 14 minutes, and the jury liked every word. He began by talking about daughters and how special they are. He told them about his own daughter and the special relationship that exists between father and daughter. He started to tell them how he would feel if she was raped by two drunk, drugged animals who tied her to a tree and, "Objection!" shouted Buckley. "Sustained," Noose shouted back. Jake ignored the shouting and continued softly. He asked the jury to try to imagine, through the whole trial, how they would feel if it was their daughter. He asked them not to find Carl Lee guilty, but to send him home to his family. He didn't talk about insanity yet. They knew it was coming. He finished shortly after he started, and left the jury with a strong sense of the difference between the two lawyers. "Is that all?" Noose asked in surprise. "Well then, Mr. Buckley, you may call your first witness." "The state calls Nora Cobb." The mother of the murdered rapist sat in the witness box and listened to Rufus Buckley as he asked her where she lived and what had happened on the day her son, Billy Ray Cobb, was killed. As Nora Cobb told her story, she started to cry. She was not a witness who could do much damage to Carl Lee, and normally Jake would not ask her any questions. But then he saw an opportunity he could not miss. He could wake up Judge Noose and start making the jury think about what people like Billy Ray Cobb were really like. He also felt that Nora Cobb's tears were the result of good acting, not deep regret. "Just a few questions," Jake said as he stood up. "Mrs. Cobb, is it true that your son sold drugs?" "Objection!" Buckley shouted, jumping to his feet. "The criminal record of the victim cannot be mentioned in court." "Sustained." Mrs. Cobb wiped her eyes and started to cry harder. "You say your son was 23 when he died. In his 23 years, how many other children did he rape?" "Objection! Objection!" shouted Buckley again. waving his arms and looking desperately at Judge Noose.
Sustained! Sustained, Mr. Briggins! You cannot ask these questions!
Mrs. Cobb burst into tears, and the sound of her crying filled the shocked courtroom. But Jake had made his point. The jury would now remember the sort of man Billy Ray Cobb had been. The next witness was Ernestine Willard, the mother of the other victim. She was less of an actress than Mrs. Cobb, but Rufus Buckley asked her the same questions he had asked the first witness, and brought the same tears to her eyes. When he had finished, Jake stood up.
Mrs. Willard, I'm Jake Briggins.
He stood in front of her and looked at her without pity.
How old was your son when he died? 27.
Buckley pushed his chair from the table and sat on its edge, ready to jump up. Noose removed his glasses and leaned forward.
During his 27 years, how many other children did he rape?
Buckley immediately shouted,
Objection! 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 Sustained! Sustained! Sustained!
The shouting frightened Mrs. Willard, and she cried louder. But, once again, Jake had made his point. Ozzie was the first state witness after lunch. Buckley questioned him first, asking him to repeat exactly what had happened on the day of the murder. He then showed Ozzie the gun that Carl Lee had used, and asked him to say if this was the one he had found near the bodies. To finish, he then brought out a set of color photographs of the murder victims, some taken so close you could see how the bullets had broken through the skin and bone. Rufus Buckley made the jury members look at each picture, pointing out the horror of the way the two men had died. He wanted them to remember the violence of what Carl Lee had done. Jake looked at his notes as he walked across the courtroom. He had just a few questions for his friend.
Sheriff, did you put Billy Ray Cobb and Pete Willard in jail?
Yes, I did, answered the sheriff.
For what reason?
For the rape of Tanya Haley.
And how old was she at the time of the rape?
She was 10.
Is it true, Sheriff, that Pete Willard signed a written document saying that he had raped Tanya Haley? Objection! Objection! Your Honor, we can't discuss this case, and Mr. Briggins knows it.
Ozzie had already said yes.
Sustained.
Please ignore the last question from Mr. Briggins, Noose told the jury.
No further questions, said Jake.
The next two witnesses gave technical evidence to show that Carl Lee Haley had, as everyone knew, killed Cobb and Willard. Again, Buckley bored the jury by going into great detail and asking long and complicated questions. The jury members were becoming increasingly tired of the sound of his voice. When it was Jake's turn to ask questions, he said that he had none. The second day of the trial started in the same way, with the jurors in their seats by 9 o'clock. Rufus Buckley brought in his next witness, the doctor who had examined Cobb and Willard's bodies. Again, Buckley talked too long and asked too many questions. No one was denying that Cobb and Willard had been killed with an M16 or that Carl Lee had killed them. So why spend so much time on it? The jury members were bored, and the judge spent a lot of time cleaning his glasses in order to stay awake. Once again, when it came to Jake's turn, he looked at the judge and said, "I have no questions." Judge Noose and the jurors all smiled. It was becoming clear which lawyer they preferred. But Buckley still didn't seem to understand what he was doing wrong. The last witness was Officer Dwayne Looney. Buckley had chosen him to speak last as a way of reminding the jury of the damage Carl Lee had done. Looney walked into the courtroom with difficulty, leaning on a stick. Buckley asked Deputy Looney his age, where he worked, and who he took to the courthouse on Monday, May 20th. He then asked what had happened when he had taken the men out of the court. Deputy Looney described how he had led the prisoners out of the court and how suddenly Carl Lee had come out of a side room.
"Then what happened?" asked Buckley.
"When Cobb was near to the foot of the stairs, the shooting started. I was waiting to go on down. I didn't see anybody for a second. Then I saw Mr. Haley with the machine gun. Cobb was blown backward into Willard, and they both screamed and fell down, trying to get back up to where I was."
"Yes, sir. Please describe what you saw."
"You could hear the bullets coming off the walls and hitting everywhere. It was the loudest gun I ever heard."
"What happened to you?"
"I never got down the stairs. I think one of the bullets came off the wall and caught me in the leg."
"And what happened to your leg?"
"They cut it off," he answered softly. "Just below the knee."
"Did you get a good look at the man with the gun?"
"Yes, sir. It was Mr. Haley, the man sitting over there." That answer was a good place to stop asking questions. But Buckley then took out large plans of the courthouse and arranged them in front of the jury so that Looney could walk around and show his bad leg. Jake rubbed his forehead, and Noose cleaned and re-cleaned his glasses. The jurors moved around in their chairs. Buckley had lost them again.
"Any questions, Mr. Briggins?"
Noose asked at last. "Just a few questions. Officer Looney, who was Carl Lee looking at when he was shooting?" "Those boys, I think."
"Did he ever look at you?"
"I don't think so."
"So he didn't aim the gun at you?"
"Oh, no, sir. He just aimed at those boys. Hit them, too."
"What did he do when he was shooting?"
"He just screamed and laughed like a crazy man. It was the strangest thing I ever heard. With all the noise, the gun firing, the bullets whistling, the boys screaming as they got hit. Over all that noise, I could hear him laughing that crazy laugh. That's what I'll always remember." The answer was so perfect that Jake had to fight off a smile. He and Looney had worked on it 100 times, and it was a thing of beauty. Every word was perfect. Jake looked through his notes and then looked up at the jurors. They were all waiting for the next question. Jake wrote something down and then looked carefully at Looney, just to make the silence last a few more seconds. "Now, Deputy Looney, Carl Lee Haley shot you in the leg." "Yes, sir, he did." "Do you think he meant to?" "No, sir. It was an accident. I do not want to see him punished for the shooting, sir. I have no bad feelings about the man. I would do the same." Buckley dropped his pen and sat back in his chair. He looked sadly at his star witness. "What do you mean by that?" Jake asked. "I mean, I don't blame him for what he did. Those boys raped his little girl. I've got a little girl. If somebody raped her, I'd kill him just like Carl Lee did. We should give him a prize. Do you want the jury to find Carl Lee guilty? Buckley jumped and shouted, "Objection! He can't ask that question!" "No," Looney shouted. "I don't want him to be found guilty. He's a hero."
Don't answer, Mr. Looney, Noose said loudly. Don't answer.
"He's a hero! Set him free!" Looney shouted at Buckley.
Order! Order!
Noose banged his table. Buckley was silent. Looney was silent. Jake walked to his chair and said he had no other questions. Looney smiled at the jury and walked slowly and painfully from the courtroom. Chapter 12. A Crazy World. Jake awoke in the darkness to the sound of his doorbell. He opened the front door in his nightshirt and found Ozzie and Deputy Nesbitt waiting for him. "What is it?" he asked as he opened the door.
"They're gonna kill you today,"
Ozzie said.
"Who?" "The Klan."
"How do you know?"
"The same man who told us about the dynamite. He calls himself Mickey Mouse. He telephoned yesterday and said you're the lucky man. Today is the big day. That's why we're here. We're coming to the office with you. We're staying with you all day."
At 5:30, they drove Jake to his office and locked the door. At 8, a group of soldiers was waiting on the sidewalk. Harry Rex and Ellen watched from the second floor of the courthouse. Jake walked between Ozzie and Nesbitt, the three of them in the middle of the group of soldiers. The Klan's man sat with his gun in his hands at a window in an old empty factory 2 blocks north and east of the square. From his position, he had a clear view of the back of the courthouse. He sat in the darkness and aimed through a small opening, knowing that no one in the world could see him. Another Klan member waited in a pickup down the road. The engine was running, and the driver sat smoking, waiting for the sound of the gun. When he saw the group of soldiers move away from Jake's office, the gunman did not know what to do. He could only see the top of Jake's head in a sea of green army hats. He could not be sure of hitting Jake, but the whiskey he had been drinking made him want some excitement. He aimed and fired, hoping for the best. When they heard the sound of the gun, the soldiers ran toward the courthouse, pulling Jake down with them. One soldier screamed in pain, holding his throat. Another shot, then another.
He's hit!
Someone shouted. Jake ran through the doors to the safety of the building. He fell onto the floor and put his head in his hands. Ozzie stood next to him, watching the soldiers through the door. The gunman ran out of the factory and threw his weapon behind the back seat of the pickup. The two men drove out of town. They were going to a funeral in South Mississippi. The soldier had been standing by Jake's left shoulder when he was hit. "This is kind of silly, ain't it?" he had just said to Jake when the bullet shot through his throat. He fell against Jake, holding his neck, losing blood fast and screaming.
"He's dead, isn't he?"
Jake asked Ozzie softly.
"He's dead. I know he's dead. I heard his neck break."
They heard later that the soldier did not die, but he was not going to be able to walk again. Jake managed with difficulty to persuade the judge that the trial could wait for another 24 hours. He stayed in the office with Harry Rex and Ellen Rourke.
After he had phoned his wife to tell her he was unhurt, he sat with his friends, talking too much and drinking too much. Dr. Bass joined them later in the day, and then Lester Haley arrived with Lucien. Lucien bought more drinks, and by the end of the afternoon, Jake was drunk enough to fall asleep on the floor. Ellen slept on the sofa in Jake's office. When Ellen woke up, the room was dark and empty and smelled of alcohol. She moved around carefully and found her boss peacefully sleeping on the floor in the conference room. It was 10 o'clock. She had slept 5 hours. She could stay at Lucien's house, but needed to change clothes. She locked the front door and walked to her car. Ellen had almost arrived at Oxford when she saw the blue lights behind her. As usual, she was driving at 75 miles an hour. She parked at the side of the road, got out of the car, and waited for the police. 2 men approached from the blue lights. Suddenly, she was knocked to the ground. A heavy blanket was thrown over her, and both men held her down. A rope was tied around her chest and waist. She kicked and swore, but could do little to help herself. One of them removed her keys from the car and opened the trunk. They threw her inside and banged it shut. One of the men then took the blue lights off their car and drove away, followed by the other in Ellen's BMW. They found a side road and followed it deep into the woods, then turned off the road into a small field where a large cross was being burned by a number of Ku Klux Klan members. The 2 men quickly put on their white robes and masks. They pulled her out of the trunk and threw her to the ground. They tied her arms and legs, placed a cloth over her mouth, and dragged her to a large pole a few feet from the cross. They tied her to the pole with her back to the Klan members. The burning cross lit the field. As the heat from the fire started to burn her, she struggled with the ropes, but she couldn't loosen them. She started to make strange crying noises deep in her throat. A masked figure left the others and approached her. She could hear his footsteps, and then felt his breath on her face.
"You nigger lover,"
he said in an educated Midwestern voice. He pulled the collar of her shirt and tore it from her back. He pulled down the zipper on her skirt, and then took out a large knife, cut the skirt and underclothes from top to bottom, and pulled them from around her. She tried to kick, but the heavy rope around her ankles held her feet to the pole.
"See what happens to nigger lovers?"
he said quietly.
"How do you like it?"
The fire was hot now. Her red hair was wet around her neck and shoulders. One of the others handed the man a long whip. He moved it up and down quickly, making it crack. Then he walked backward, carefully measuring the distance to the pole. He brought the whip up in the air and aimed at her back. But the tallest Klan leader stepped forward and raised his hand to stop the arm from coming down. Nothing was said, but the whip was put away. The man walked back to her and cut her hair with his knife until the skin of her head could be seen, ugly and bleeding. She made quiet crying sounds, but did not move. The Klan members moved away to their cars. A can of gasoline was poured inside the BMW with Massachusetts numbers, and somebody threw a match. The car burned very quickly. When he was certain they were gone, the man Ozzie called Mickey Mouse came out from the bushes. He untied her and carried her away from the field. He tried to cover her with what was left of her clothes. He then drove to Oxford to a payphone and called the county sheriff. Jake woke with another headache, but he knew that he had to go to court and face the world again. When he got into court, Judge Noose asked him how he was feeling. He said he felt better than the soldier who got hit. Jake's first witness was the psychiatrist, Dr. W.T. Bass. Jake was pleased that he did not look drunk. He looked good, in an expensive suit and white shirt. He even sounded good, as Jake led him through a long series of questions about his qualifications and his experience as a psychiatrist. Then Buckley got up to ask some questions. He asked how many books Dr. Bass had written. None. He asked how many hospitals he worked in. None. He asked how many patients the doctor saw. A few. As the questions continued, Dr. Bass began to look less good, and Jake felt more worried. Jake returned to the list of questions in his notebook. He asked Dr. Bass when and how often he had examined Carl Lee Haley. He asked about Carl Lee's experience in Vietnam and the effect it had had on him. Carl Lee listened carefully. The doctor was sounding good again. Jake then asked him about the rape, and Dr. Bass explained how Carl Lee had been unbalanced by the rape, how he had stopped being himself. Then, when he visited his daughter in hospital, she told him how she had called for him in the woods. She thought she saw him, but he didn't come. She continued calling, but the men told her she had no father now. Dr. Bass then answered questions about the insanity defense and the Monotone rule on which it was based. Bass explained that the rule went back to England in 1843, when Daniel Monotone tried to kill a politician called Sir Robert Peel. He did not succeed, but accidentally shot and killed the politician's secretary. During his trial, it became clear that Monotone was insane, and the jury decided that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. From this, the Monotone rule was made, and it is still followed in England and 16 U.S. states. "What does the Monotone rule really mean?" Jake asked.
Well, it's fairly simple. To use insanity as a defense, you must prove that the person did what he or she did because they had a mental disease, or that they did not know the nature and quality of what they were doing.
Can you simplify that?
Yes. If someone cannot tell the difference between right and wrong, he or she is legally insane. This is what happened to Carl Lee Haley. After the rape, he expected someone to kill the rapists. He couldn't understand why it did not happen. He didn't know what else to do. He had to kill them.
Jake let the jury think about these words. Now, Dr. Bass, do you have an opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, whether Carl Lee Haley was able to know the difference between right and wrong when he shot these men?
I have.
And what is that opinion?
Because of his mental condition, he was unable to tell right from wrong.
Thank you, Doctor. Jake picked up his notebook and walked back to his seat. He looked at Lucien, who was smiling, and at the jury. They were watching Bass and thinking about what he had said. Wanda Warnack, a young, kind-looking woman, looked at Jake and smiled.
It was the most positive signal he had received from the jury since the trial started.
Pretty good,
Carl Lee said quietly. Judge Noose asked Buckley if he had any questions.
Just a few,
Buckley said as he walked to the front of the courtroom.
Dr. Bass, what is your full name?
Jake froze. There was something wrong about the question.
William Tyler Bass. What name are you generally known by?
W.T. Bass.
Have you ever been known as Tyler Bass?
The medical witness hesitated. No, he said. Jake felt a sudden fear in his stomach. The question could only mean trouble.
You're telling this jury that on October 17th, 1956, in Dallas, Texas, you were not found guilty of a crime under the name of Tyler Bass?
That's a lie,
Bass said quietly.
Are you sure it's a lie? Buckley asked. Do you know a lie from the truth, Dr. Bass? Do you know the difference between right and wrong? Because, Dr. Bass, I've got some photographs of you taken by the Dallas Police Department on September 11th, 1956, when you were charged with the rape of a 17-year-old girl.
The silence in the room was complete. W.T. Bass could only look at the ground. He knew that there was nothing he could say. No one would believe him.
We have no further questions for the defense's medical witness, Buckley said.
A speech was needed. A brilliant, emotional explanation that would touch the hearts of the jurors and make them cry with pity for Bass and for Carl Lee. But Jake could think of nothing to say. He wanted to be sick. Everything had fallen to pieces. Buckley had destroyed his medical witness and had destroyed the insanity defense he had tried to build. And it was all Jake's fault. He thought he was so clever. He thought he would win. And he had chosen a medical witness who was a drunk and a rapist. Nothing could help Carl Lee now. Dr. Bass walked out of the courtroom, but no one watched him go.
Mr. Briggins, you may call your next witness.
Jake tried to stand up, but his legs felt like water. As he stood up, Ozzie came to his rescue. The sheriff approached the clerk of the court and gave him a message. The clerk handed this to the judge, who read it, and then looked up and said that the court would take a break for an hour. He asked the lawyers to come to his office. As soon as they were in the room, Ozzie turned and spoke to Jake.
Jake, I have some bad news. I got a call an hour ago from the sheriff of Lafayette County. Your law clerk, Ellen Rourke, is in hospital.
Jake had thought that things could not get worse. It seemed that they could.
What happened? The Klan got her last night, somewhere between here and Oxford. They tied her to a tree.
How is she? Jake asked.
She'll be okay.
What happened?
Buckley asked.
We ain't sure. They stopped her car somehow and took her out in the woods, cut her clothes off her, and cut her hair. She's got cuts on the head, so they think she was beaten.
Jake needed to be sick. He couldn't speak. The judge looked at him and said they'd better take a break until 2 o'clock. At the end of the afternoon, Jake walked slowly up the front steps to his office. He wanted to kill W.T. Bass, to break the head of the so-called friend who had introduced him to the drunk psychiatrist. Lucien was there, holding a drink. They said nothing. Lucien looked away. Then he spoke, in an unusually quiet voice.
You should know that according to Bass, the girl was 17 and the daughter of a judge in Dallas. They fell in love, but got caught on the judge's sofa. The judge had big political connections and got Bass arrested for rape. But they were in love, so before he got put in prison, he married her. She had a perfect baby boy, the first grandchild. The judge dropped the rape charge, and Bass didn't have to go to prison.
Lucien drank and watched the lights from the square. "What happened to the girl?" asked Jake.
According to Bass, a week before he finished medical school, his wife and the little boy were killed in a train accident in Fort Worth. That's when he started drinking and stopped living.
Jake looked out of the window. There was nothing to say.
How's Roark? Lucien asked.
They say she'll be okay. I called her room and a nurse said she couldn't talk. I'll go over tomorrow.
I hope she's okay. She's a fine girl, said Lucien.
I feel like it's my fault, Lucien.
It's not your fault. It's a crazy world, Jake. Full of crazy people. Right now, I think half of them are in Ford County.
Jake stayed at the office that night, talking to Lucien. He fell asleep on the sofa, but was woken at midnight by Deputy Nesbitt shouting, "Get up, Jake! You've got to go home! It's an emergency!" Jake jumped to his feet and followed Nesbitt. Adams Street was blocked by fire engines parked in front of Jake's house. The firefighters worked desperately, directing jets of water at the center of the fire. Jake saw Ozzie standing near a police car with the fire chief. The fire was brilliant. Flames came from every window across the front of the house, upstairs and down. At the side of the house, Carla's car burned inside and out. After watching for a minute or two as the water disappeared into the flames with no noticeable effect, the fire chief said, "It'll burn to the ground." The Klan had done a good job. After Bass and Ellen Rourke, Jake thought he had hit the bottom. Now he began to think there was no bottom. Jake turned to Deputy Nesbitt. "Will you do something for me?" "Sure, Jake." "Drive over to Harry Rex's and bring him back. I'd hate him to miss this." "Sure." For 2 hours, Jake, Ozzie, Harry Rex, and Nesbitt sat on the police car and watched the fire burn. It burned until morning. As the sun began to appear, Jake thanked the firefighters. He and Harry Rex walked through the backyard and looked at the damage.
"Oh, well," Harry Rex said. "It's just a house."
"Would you call Carla and tell her that?"
"No, I think you should."
"I think I'll wait."
Harry Rex looked at his watch. "It's about breakfast time, isn't it?"
"It's Sunday morning, Harry Rex. Nothing's open."
"Ah, Jake, I'm a professional. I can find hot food at any time of any day.
The truck stop?
The truck stop.
Okay. And when we finish, we'll go to Oxford to check on Roark. Chapter 13. The Trial Ends. Clanton returned to normal Monday morning as the crowd of blacks and whites gathered in the square. The soldiers were there to keep the peace. The Klan were louder than ever. They had begun to think they might win, and were pleased with the direct hit on Jake's house. Jake felt lonely walking into the court without Ellen. He and Harry Rex had been to see her at the hospital, and she was going to be okay. She had been badly frightened, but now she was angry and desperately wanted Jake to win. He did too, but did not feel so confident. He could still remember how sick he had felt, and how he could not find anything to say when Buckley had destroyed Dr. Bass. "Does the state have any final witness?" Judge Noose asked Rufus Buckley. "One witness, Your Honor." Dr. Roadheaver sat carefully in the witness chair and looked at the jury. He looked like a real psychiatrist. Dark suit, no cowboy boots. Buckley stood and smiled at the jury. "Are you Dr. Wilbert Roadheaver?" "I am," he replied. Buckley asked the doctor questions, 1,000,000 questions, about his educational and professional background. Roadheaver was confident, relaxed, prepared, and he was used to being in the witness chair. He gave good answers. Jake had no questions. Buckley then asked Dr. Roadheaver to describe his examination of Carl Lee Haley. Dr. Roadheaver said that Carl Lee was fairly helpful and able to talk about his experience in Vietnam and his family, but said that he was unable to remember details of the day of the murder. The doctor talked about the number of times he had met Carl Lee and the questions he had asked. He said that it was his opinion that Mr. Haley had carefully planned what he did, and he knew what he was doing. "Did you know," asked Buckley, "that another psychiatrist, a Dr. W.T. Bass, has told this jury that Mr. Haley was unable to recognize the difference between right and wrong, and that he was insane when he murdered these two men?" "Yes, I did know that." "Do you agree with that opinion?" "No, I do not, and I do not find it professionally acceptable. Mr. Haley himself has said that he planned the murders. By saying this, he has shown that he was not insane. He knew what he was doing, and he knew right from wrong." "Doctor, what, therefore, is your medical opinion of the mental condition of Mr. Haley on the day he shot Billy Ray Cobb, Peter Willard, and Deputy Dwayne Looney?" "His mental condition was normal, and he could tell right from wrong." "Thank you, Doctor. I have no further questions." "Any questions, Mr. Briggins?" Noose asked. "A few questions, Your Honor." Working from his notes, Jake asked Dr. Roadheaver a series of careful questions about the theory of psychiatry. The doctor agreed that psychiatry could never be an exact science, and that there would always be different opinions. Jake then asked how many cases Dr. Roadheaver had been a witness in. He replied that this was the 43rd. Jake checked something in a file and looked at the doctor with a nasty little smile. "Are you sure it's not your 46th? "It could be, yes. I'm not certain." The courtroom became still. Buckley looked up from his notes and watched his witness carefully. 46 times you've spoken for the state in insanity trials? If you say so. And 46 times you've said that the defendant was not legally insane. Correct, Doctor?
I'm not sure.
Well, let me make it simple. You've been a witness 46 times, and 46 times it has been your opinion the defendant was not legally insane. Correct?
Roadheaver moved in his chair and for the first time looked uncomfortable.
I'm not sure.
You've never seen a legally insane defendant, have you, Doctor?
Of course I have.
Good. Would you then, please, sir, tell us the name of the defendant and where he was tried?
Roadheaver breathed deeply and looked at the ceiling. Jake looked across at the jurors. They were awake and waiting for an answer.
I can't remember, he finally said.
Jake lifted a pile of papers and waved it at the witness.
Is it possible, Doctor, that the reason you can't remember is that in 11 years, 46 trials, you have never spoken for the defendant?
I honestly can't remember.
Can you honestly name us one trial in which you found the defendant to be legally insane?
I'm sure there are some.
Yes or no, Doctor? One trial?
The medical witness looked at Buckley.
No. My memory fails me. I cannot.
Jake walked slowly to the defense table and picked up a thick file.
Dr. Roadheaver, do you remember being a witness in the trial of a man by the name of Danny Booker in McMurphy County in December 1975?
Yes, I remember that trial.
And you said that he was not legally insane, didn't you?
That is correct.
Do you remember how many psychiatrists spoke for him?
Not exactly. There were several.
There were 3, Dr. Roadheaver, and they all said the man was legally insane. How many other doctors agreed with you?
None, if I remember correctly.
So it was 3 against 1.
Yes, but
what did the jury do, Doctor?
He was found not guilty by reason of insanity.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Roadheaver, you're the head doctor at Whitfield Psychiatric Hospital, aren't you?
Yes.
And where is Danny Booker today?
Roadheaver looked desperately at Buckley, but then had to turn back to Jake to answer the question. He waited 1 second too long for the jury. They were losing trust in him.
He's at Whitfield, isn't he?
Jake asked.
I believe so,
Roadheaver said.
And is this man legally insane, Doctor?
I don't think so.
But you said in court that Danny Booker was not mad and understood what he was doing when he killed his wife. The jury disagreed with you and found him not guilty, and since that time he has been a patient in your hospital, under your care, and treated as a patient with a mental illness. Is that correct?
The jury could see that it was. And Jake then asked the doctor about 5 more cases, 4 men and 1 woman. In each one, Dr. Roadheaver had said the person was not insane. But in each case, the jury had disagreed, and now they were all in Dr. Roadheaver's hospital.
Jake asked how this was possible.
"You just can't trust juries,"
said the doctor, without thinking. Jake looked at him with a sad smile, then looked at the jury. He folded his arms and allowed Roadheaver's words to sink in. He waited, looking at the witness. Finally, he turned to the judge. "I think we've heard enough from this witness, Your Honor. We have no more questions." Jake knew that he had destroyed Buckley's medical witness. There were no more witnesses. It was time for the closing arguments. Jake talked directly to the jury. He began with his biggest problem, Dr. W.T. Bass. He apologized to the jury. He asked them to believe that he would never use a man with a criminal record as a witness if he knew the facts. He raised his hand and swore to them that he had not known. He then asked them to think about what Dr. Bass had said. Yes, 30 years ago he had had sex with a girl under 18 in Texas. Does that mean he is lying now in this trial? Does that mean you cannot trust his professional opinion? Be fair to Bass the psychiatrist. Forget Bass the person. And please, be fair to his patient, Carl Lee Haley. He knew nothing of the doctor's past. Then Jake told them that the girl had become Bass's wife and had died with their child in a train crash. Mr. Buckley had not mentioned that. He waited a moment and let them think about it. "And what about Dr. Roadheaver?" he asked. "Maybe he had sex with a girl under 18 once. Maybe he didn't. Does that make him a better or a worse psychiatrist? The problem with Dr. Roadheaver is that although he is a highly trained doctor who treats thousands of people for all sorts of mental illnesses, when crimes are involved, he cannot recognize insanity." They watched him, listened to every word. He was not loud and overconfident like Buckley. He was quiet. He looked tired, almost hurt. Jake asked the jury to forgive him for his lack of experience. If he had made mistakes, it was not his client's fault. He talked about daughters. He told the jury about his own daughter. She was 4, almost 5, and she was the center of his world. She was special. She was a little girl, and he had to protect her. Carl Lee had a daughter. Her name was Tanya. He pointed to her on the front row, next to her mother and brothers. She's a beautiful little girl, 10 years old, and now she can never have children. She can never have a daughter.
"Objection!"
Buckley shouted.
"Sustained."
Jake talked about rape and explained how rape is much worse than murder. With murder, the victim is gone and not forced to deal with what happened to her. The family must deal with it, but not the victim. But rape is much worse. The victim has a lifetime of trying to understand, of asking questions, and knowing the rapist may someday escape or be freed. Every hour of every day, the victim thinks of the rape and asks herself 1,000 questions. She relives it step by step, minute by minute, and it hurts just as badly. And if this happens to a child, a 10-year-old child?
Imagine you're a parent. How would you explain to your child why she was raped? How would you explain why she cannot have children?
Objection! Sustained. Please ignore that, ladies and gentlemen.
What would you do? Asked Jake. What would a father do? Jake paused for a drink of water. He changed direction now. He stopped looking hurt. He looked angry. He talked about Cobb and Willard, drug sellers and rapists. Was this country a better place without them? Certainly. And Deputy Looney, a man who had lost a leg, thought so too. He had said that they should thank Carl Lee for what he had done. He was a hero. He asked the jury to follow Looney's wishes. He became much quieter and said he was almost finished. He wanted to leave them with one thought. Picture this, if they could. When she was lying there, beaten, covered in her own blood, tied to 2 trees, she had looked into the woods around her. She wanted her daddy. She thought he was coming, but it was only a dream. Ladies and gentlemen, he continued, she needs him now, as much as she needed him then. Please, don't take him away. She's waiting on the front row for her daddy. Let him go home to his family. The courtroom was silent as Jake sat down next to his client. He looked at the jury and saw Wanda Warnack brush away a tear with her finger. For the first time in 2 days, he felt some hope. At 4 o'clock, Judge Noose spoke to the jury. He told them to get organized and get busy. He told them they could discuss things until 6, maybe 7, but if they could not make a decision, he would ask them to meet again on Tuesday morning. They stood up and walked out. No one expected a quick decision. Chapter 14. Guilty or not guilty? The jury did not make a decision by 7 o'clock, and Judge Noose instructed them to go back to their hotel and return to the court at 9 a.m. the next day. Jake went back to Lucien's house. He had no home, no wife, no law clerk, but at least he had some friends. Harry Rex joined them, and they sat on the porch drinking beer and eating fried potatoes. They could only wait. Jake had done everything he could. At 9 a.m. the next day, the square in front of the courthouse was crowded again. Reverend Agee led his people as they shouted louder and louder, "Free Carl Lee! Free Carl Lee!" The clan shouted back, "Fry Carl Lee!" But not as loudly as before. There seemed to be fewer of them today, and they did not seem so confident. Everyone had been talking about Jake's final speech. The jury arrived and began their discussion in the jury room. Jake and Harry Rex sat in the empty courtroom looking across at Buckley. By midday, there was still no decision, but the crowds outside the courthouse were getting bigger. During lunch, the 10,000 grew to 15,000. Carl Lee had been allowed to come into the courtroom and sit with Tanya and the others. At 4 o'clock, around the time when the jury had to report to the judge, they walked to one of the tall windows at the front of the courtroom. Carl Lee noticed a small handle. He turned it, and the windows swung open. Carl Lee looked at the deputy beside him and stepped forward. He held Tanya in the air and watched the crowd. They saw him. They shouted his name and rushed to the building under him.
Reverend Agee led the marchers off the street and across the square. A wave of black people pressed forward for a closer look at their man. "Free Carl Lee! Free Carl Lee! Free Carl Lee!" He waved at his people below him. He kissed his daughter and his sons. He waved and told the children to wave too. The crowd went wild. Judge Noose asked to see the lawyers in his office. He was worried. Buckley was angry and wanted a new trial. He said that the jury could not make a fair decision with this crowd outside. Jake laughed at him and said that he had wanted the trial to be moved away from Clanton. It was too late now. Buckley then said that the jury should be moved to another place while they made up their minds. Jake brought out a pile of legal documents which showed that this could not be done. They had to finish this business in Clanton. When the jury came in to report, apart from the reporters, the courtroom was solid black. The Klan had clearly decided it was not a good place to be. The jurors looked tired and unhappy.
"Have you made a decision?" Judge Noose asked.
"No, sir," replied the head of the jury.
"Do you think you will be able to make a decision if you have more time?"
"We've talked about that, Your Honor, and we'd like to leave, get a good night's rest, and try again tomorrow. We're not ready to stop." Wednesday. For the first time in weeks, Jake slept more than 8 hours. He had fallen asleep on the sofa in his office, and he awoke at 5 to the sounds of the army getting ready for the worst. He had rested, but he could not stop thinking that this would probably be the big day. He showered and shaved downstairs. He then took a new shirt from its packet and dressed himself in Lucien's best dark blue suit. It was too short and a bit loose, but not a bad fit under the circumstances. He thought about his house on Adams Street and how Carla would feel. For the first time in a week, he went across to the coffee shop for breakfast. The manager, Dell, greeted him like a lost child and came and sat next to him at a corner table. As the other customers arrived and saw him, they stopped and shook his hand. It was good to see him again. They had missed him, and they were on his side. He looked thin, Dell said, so he ordered most of the things on the menu. It felt good to be there. He stayed for an hour and talked to people, then went across to his office. There was nothing to do except wait. He sat by the window, drank coffee, smoked a cigarette, and watched the soldiers. He thought about a quiet little southern law office with a secretary and clients waiting to see him. Of normal things, like a family, a home, and church on Sunday mornings. Maybe he should leave these big cases to others. When the jury arrived at 9 a.m. as usual, there were even more people than the day before. The jurors could see nothing but a sea of black faces when their bus stopped outside the court. They were scared. In the jury room, Wanda Warnack stood at the end of the table and nervously asked for attention.
"I have a suggestion," she said slowly, "that might help us decide this thing."
Suddenly, she had their complete attention.
"I thought of something last night when I couldn't sleep, and I want you to think about it, too. It may be painful. It may make you search your heart and take a long look at your soul. But I'll ask you to do it anyway. And if each of you will be honest with yourself, I think we can finish before midday."
The only sounds came from the street below.
Good. This is what I want you to do. I want you to pretend with me for a moment. I want you to use your imaginations. I want you to close your eyes and listen to my voice and nothing else.
They closed their eyes. They were ready to try anything. At around 11 o'clock, the phone rang in Jake's office. It rang again, and Lucien answered it. He listened, then put the phone down.
"What is it?"
Harry Rex demanded. Jake sat up and looked at Lucien. The moment had arrived.
"The jury is ready."
"Oh, my God," Jake said.
"Listen to me, Jake," said Lucien. "Stay calm. Be careful what you say."
"That's strange advice coming from you, Lucien," Jake replied.
"I've learned a lot. If you win, be careful what you say to reporters. Make sure you thank the jury. If you lose..."
"If you lose,"
Harry Rex said,
"run as fast as you can, because those people out there will bring down the courthouse."
"I feel weak," said Jake. When Jake entered the courtroom, Carl Lee was already there, sitting at the defense table. Gwen and Lester had tears in their eyes. The children were confused and scared. Judge Noose came to his chair and sat down, and the courtroom became totally silent. There was no sound from the outside. 20,000 blacks knelt on the ground and prayed. There was perfect silence inside the courtroom and out. The door from the jury room opened, and it seemed like an hour before the first juror came out with tears in her eyes. Jake dropped his head. Carl Lee looked ahead at a painting on the wall above Judge Noose's seat. The jurors slowly took their places. They seemed scared. Most had been crying. Jake felt sick. The head of the jury held a piece of paper.
"Ladies and gentlemen, have you made your decision?"
"Yes, sir, we have,"
he answered quietly. His voice shook as he spoke.
"Hand it to the clerk, please."
She took it and handed it to His Honor, who studied it.
"It is technically in order," he finally said.
One juror was crying, the only sound in the courtroom. Other jurors held handkerchiefs to their eyes. The crying could mean only one thing to Jake. Noose looked at Carl Lee.
"Will the defendant please rise?"
Jake's client stood up slowly. Jake closed his eyes and stopped breathing. His hand shook and his stomach ached. Noose handed the paper back to the clerk of the court.
"Please read it, Madam Clerk."
She unfolded it and faced the defendant.
"On each of the charges against him, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty by reason of insanity."
The courtroom exploded. Carl Lee turned and ran to where his children were sitting. Tanya and the boys reached forward and held him. Gwen screamed and burst into tears. She buried her head in Lester's arms. People stood on the seats and shouted, "Praise the Lord!" Jake felt nothing. His only movement was a weak smile in the direction of the jury. He wanted to cry, but just sat at the defense table, trying to smile, unable to do anything else. From the corner of his eye, he could see Buckley removing files and important-looking papers and throwing them all into bags. A boy ran between two deputies and out of the door, shouting, "Not guilty! Not guilty!" to the crowd waiting outside. Judge Noose looked at the lawyers. If there's nothing else, this court will now close. As I have heard nothing to say that Mr. Haley is now insane, he is free to leave this court.
Carl Lee stood in the middle of his family. They had their arms around him, and everyone was crying and shouting, "Praise the Lord." They gathered round Jake and held him and said they loved him. The reporters began firing questions at Jake. He held up his hands and said he would make no comments now, but there would be a conference in his office at 2 p.m. Buckley left through a side door. The jurors went back to the jury room to wait for the last bus ride to the hotel. The reporters crowded round Carl Lee.
"I just want to go home,"
he said again and again.
"I just want to go home."
After the dancing in the square outside the courthouse had ended, after the thousands of happy supporters had all gone home, Jake, Harry Rex, and Lucien went to Lucien's house and ate a mountain of pork and vegetables.
"You look very silly,"
Harry Rex said to Jake.
"Shut up, Harry Rex," Lucien said. "Let him enjoy his finest hour."
"He's enjoying it. Look at that smile."
"What should I tell reporters?" Jake asked.
"Tell him you need some clients,"
Harry Rex said.
"Clients will be no problem," Lucien said. "They'll be waiting on the sidewalks asking to meet you."
They drove back into town in Harry Rex's old Ford. As they passed a row of houses on the right, Jake asked him to stop. Harry Rex pulled off the road and parked under a tree. Jake got out, looked around the front yard, and walked onto the porch. He knocked on the door. A man asked who was there. "I'm Jake Briggins," and the door flew open, and the man came out and took Jake's hand.
"Nice to meet you, Jake. I'm Mac Lloyd Crowell. You've done a good job. I'm proud to meet you."
Jake shook his hand.
"You looking for Wanda?"
Crowell asked.
"Well, yes. I was just passing, and I remembered her address from the jury research." "You've come to the right place. She lives here, and I do too most of the time. We ain't married, but we go together. She's lying down resting. She's pretty tired."
"Don't wake her," Jake said.
"She told me what happened. She won it for you."
"How? What happened?"
"She made them all close their eyes and listen to her. She told them to pretend that the little girl had blonde hair and blue eyes, that the two rapists were black, that they tied her right foot to a tree and her left foot to a fence post, that they raped her repeatedly and swore at her because she was white. She told them to picture the little girl lying there, begging for her daddy, while they kicked her in the mouth and knocked out her teeth, broke both jaws, broke a nose. She made them imagine two drunk blacks pouring beer on her like that and laughing. And then she told them to imagine that the little girl belonged to them, their daughter. She told them to be honest with themselves and to write on a piece of paper whether or not they would kill those men if they got the chance. And they voted on it. All 12 said they would do the killing. 12-0. Wanda said she'd sit in that jury room until Christmas before she'd vote that Carl Lee was guilty. And if they were honest with themselves, then they ought to feel the same way. They agreed with her.
Jake listened to every word without breathing. He heard a noise. Wanda Warnack walked to the screen door. She smiled at him and began crying. He looked at her, but could not talk. She wiped her eyes and looked at him and shook the hand he held out to her.
100 cars were parked east and west of the Haley house. The long front yard was packed with vehicles, children playing, and parents sitting under trees. Harry Rex parked, and a crowd rushed to greet Carl Lee's lawyer. Lester held him and said, "You've done it again." Carl Lee came out, and they shook hands and smiled at each other, both searching for words. They put their arms round each other. The crowd clapped and shouted.
"Thank you, Jake,"
Carl Lee said softly. At 2:30, Jake sat at his desk and talked to Carla on the phone, while Lucien and Harry Rex drank beer. He told his wife he would leave in 3 hours and be in North Carolina tomorrow. Yes, he was fine, he said. Everything was okay. It was all finished. There was a crowd of reporters in his conference room, so she shouldn't miss the evening news. He said he loved her. Tomorrow, he'd call Ellen. "Why are you leaving?" Lucien demanded. "You're stupid, Jake. Just stupid," Harry Rex shouted. "You've got 1,000 reporters waiting for you, and you're leaving town. Stupid. Just stupid." Jake stood up. "How do I look?" "Pretty stupid if you leave," Harry Rex said. "Wait for a couple of days," Lucien said. "This is an opportunity you'll never have again. Please, Jake." "Relax. I'm going to meet them now. Let them take my picture, answer a few questions. Then I'm leaving town. I've got to talk to my wife. I've got a lot of explaining to do." "You're crazy, Jake," Harry Rex said. "I agree," said Lucien. Jake looked in the mirror, straightened his borrowed tie, and smiled at his friends. "I love you too. I really do. And hey, I got paid $900 for this trial, and I plan to share it with you." They emptied the last cans of beer and followed Jake Brigance down the stairs to face the reporters.